Love is a trembling happiness, commented writer Khalil Gibran. It is likely that more songs and poems have been written about love than any other subject. And of course, many of the famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have addressed themselves to the subject of love. Here's a brief sampling. Psychiatrist Carl Jung said this, and I'm quoting him: "Love makes a man better, hate makes him worse." St. Paul, in perhaps the most famous words ever expressed about love, said this: "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not insist on its own way. It bears all things, hopes all things, endures all things." And Sigmund Freud, with a somewhat different take on love, said this: "We are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love." I must add, by the way, that Freud believed that it was very important for our mental health that we love. But like other great thinkers, he saw the downside of love as well as the upside of love. John Powell, in his book entitled "Why Are We Afraid to Love?" said this: "True love demands self-forgetfulness." And Dostoevsky, in his very famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov, has a character say this: "What is hell? What is hell? It is the suffering of being unable to love." And Professor Leo Buscaglia, who wrote a book entitled Love, and perhaps whom you remember because he lectured pretty regularly on the subject on PBS many years ago, he had these hard-hitting words about love: "Most of us never learn to love at all. We play at love, imitate lovers, treat love as a game." This is the first in a series of programs I will be doing on the subject of love. And I will address myself to some basic questions. Among them are: what is love? What are the elements of love? What can each of us do to become a better lover? What are some common illusions people often have about love? And can society do anything to encourage or discourage love? And of course, the program will be based in large part on what the great thinkers have said in addressing themselves to those questions. Let's start with perhaps the most important question: what is love? The ancient Greeks distinguished several different types of love. They talked about eros and agape. Eros, according to the Greeks, was erotic love. It involves a sexual yearning. Whereas agape is a spiritual love. It's not a love for a particular person, but rather more or less a love of mankind. My favorite definition of love comes from professor and ethicist Joseph Fletcher. Fletcher, in his writings, has said that love and justice are one and the same thing. He says that love is justice. To be loving is to be just. To be just is to be loving. Psychiatrist Howard Cutler, in his book called The Art of Happiness, a book co-authored with the Dalai Lama, by the way, psychiatrist Cutler defines love this way. He says, "It's an unqualified wish for the happiness of another human being, an unqualified wish for the happiness of another human being." The best book I know of on the subject of love, certainly the most thought-provoking book I've ever read on the subject, is Erich Fromm's very famous The Art of Loving. For those who have never heard of Fromm, Fromm was a very famous 20th century psychoanalyst. And in his book, again entitled The Art of Loving, Fromm says that love is not primarily a relationship to a specific person. Love is not primarily a relationship to a specific person. Rather, it is an attitude towards the world. And it's this attitude that determines the relatedness of a person to the world as a whole, and not towards one object of love. Fromm goes on to say that a person inevitably loves all people if he or she loves one person. Fromm sounds like Christ and Buddha in the following passage, which again is from his book. Dr. Fromm says, if I have developed the capacity to love, then I cannot help loving my brothers, meaning mankind. In brotherly love, there is the experience of union with all men, of human solidarity, of human at-one-ment. What can cause this experience of brotherly love, love of mankind? Well, Fromm says that among the experiences that can cause it are fellow feeling, empathy, the ability to identify with other people, and compassion. Fromm indicates that to love someone doesn't mean you have to like the person. To love someone doesn't mean you have to like the person. Jesus addressed himself to this. In Matthew 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, perhaps the most famous part of the New Testament, Jesus says, and I'm quoting him, love your enemies. Love your enemies. And Jesus sets it down as a commandment, not a request. What did Jesus mean? What did he mean when he said, love your enemies? I think the meaning is quite obvious. What he's saying is, treat everyone, whether you like the person or not, fairly, justly, decently. That's love. I mentioned before that Fromm said that in brotherly love, there is the experience of union with all men, of human solidarity, of human at-one-ment. What I'd like to do is to give an illustration of this. And I suggest that an experiment, which we can all conduct, would provide the illustration. Indeed, I believe that some of you have, perhaps many of you, have already conducted this kind of experiment. It would be an experiment that one would conduct in a public place, such as a bus, a subway car, a subway station, a ferry boat. I suggest that when you are in this public space, or when I am in this public space, we look around. Look at faces around you. What do you feel when you look at the faces around you? What do all of us have in common in that subway car, bus, other public space? I think among the things we all have in common as human beings are the following. We all want to be happy. We all experience anxiety, fears, and sadness. And of course, we will all die. Well, what's the proof of brotherly love? Again, if one is in that public space and looking around, looking at faces specifically. Well, as I indicated before, I think if one has fellow feeling, if one has empathy, if one can identify with the other people in that subway car or bus, that's an indication one has brotherly love. But it goes beyond that. It also includes a desire, as I suggested before, to treat all people justly, and also a desire to alleviate suffering. I think that if one is good at brotherly love, one has the desire on the ferry boat, in the subway car, to alleviate people's suffering, if one was able to do that. And of course, finally, brotherly love, I think, assumes that each of us has a desire not to be a happiness stealer, that each of us has a desire not to be a happiness stealer. Bertrand Russell, one of the great philosophers, claimed that perhaps the most common kind of stealing in the world is happiness stealing, which people can do through sarcasm, through spitefulness, through meanness. There are innumerable ways people can try to steal other people's happiness. Well, I'm suggesting to you that someone who is very good at brotherly love goes out of his or her way to avoid stealing someone's happiness, and indeed tries to do the opposite, tries to promote the happiness of other people. How common is love? How common is love? Some songs claim that love is all around. But Dr. Fromm, in his book, The Art of Loving, says that's not so. Fromm says that love is rare. He says that love is an art, and since it has to be learned, very few people have learned it. And as a consequence, in his opinion, it's rare. I mentioned early on Professor Leo Buscaglia's comment in his book entitled Love, and I mentioned his hard-hitting words, and here they are again. Most of us never learn to love. We play at love. We play at love, imitate lovers, treat love as a game. Fromm talks about how often people fail at love. Here are his own words. There is hardly any activity, any enterprise, which is started with such tremendous hopes and expectations, and yet which fails so regularly as love. Well, what to do if love is rare? What to do? What can we all do to improve our love lives? First, Fromm suggests that we realize it's a learned activity. Again, he calls it an art. He says that if we wish to learn how to love, we must proceed in the same way we would if we wanted to learn carpentry or painting or becoming a doctor or learning how to teach. Buscaglia says this. Buscaglia in his book says that in addition to learning about the elements of love, we must learn about what qualities make up a loving person. What qualities make up a loving person? Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck has said that if we are to become better lovers, we must realize that love is a form of work. And the Jesuit priest, John Powell, has said that if we are to get better at loving, we must move beyond me, me, me. Father Powell has said that true love demands self-forgetfulness. And Father Powell has said that so many people are so preoccupied, so focused on their own pain, that they can't get very much out of themselves to love other people. Fromm also adds that love is not just a strong feeling, it's a decision. He says feelings may come and go, but if one is a good lover, one has made, whether one realizes it or not, a decision to love people. Fromm gets very specific. Dr. Fromm gets very specific in talking about what he considers to be the basic elements of all forms of love. In his book, he talks about romantic love, which he calls erotic love. He talks about parental love. He writes about love of mankind, writes about love of self, writes about love of God. But again, here, he enumerates what he says are elements common to all forms of love. First of all, he says that love involves giving. And I'm quoting him, "Love is primarily giving, not receiving." He then goes on to say that caring, is a very important element of love. And what does it involve? Well, Fromm says that when we love someone, we have concern for that person's growth and life. And we show this concern by nurturing the person or persons. Dr. Fromm has said that to make something grow is to nurture that something. Responsibility is another element of love that Fromm emphasizes. And what does this involve? Well, responsibility involves responding to other people's needs, whether those needs are expressed or unexpressed. And when he's talking about other people's needs, he's talking primarily about their psychic needs, their emotional, mental needs. although he's talking about other needs as well. The major religions claim that we are our brother's keepers, and therefore we do have a responsibility to the extent that we can to look after other people, that we are responsible to a certain extent for other people. M. Scott Peck, in his book entitled The Road Less Traveled, says this: love is as love does. Love is as love does. Fromm goes on to explain that respect is also an important element of love. And what does he mean by that? He says that respect is concern for the person's individuality. He says that when we respect someone, that involves an absence of exploitation and domination. That if we are trying to exploit someone, or if we are trying to dominate someone, then there is an absence of love. That if we are on power trips with those people we think we love, perhaps we're not expressing the love that we wish to love, because power trips, Fromm claims, always get in the way of loving other people. An example of this idea of respect for a person's individuality being an element of love would be, I think, the following. Let's look at the example of a father who is very interested in sports, and maybe he himself is a superb athlete, and he finds that his son, whom he dreamed about becoming a great athlete, has little or no interest in sports, that perhaps his main interest is music, and maybe even classical music. Well, Fromm would say, if that father really loves his son, that he will not try to dominate his son and try to persuade him that sports are more important than playing a musical instrument, but will rather nurture his son's interest in perhaps classical music and maybe even in playing the violin. Erich Fromm claims that knowledge is also a very important element of love. He points out that there are many layers of knowledge, and he's talking specifically about psychological knowledge. He's talking about seeing beyond the surface. Fromm gives an example of this. He says that if we are to know a person or persons, we must see beyond the mask or masks that we all wear. For example, Fromm says that if we are good lovers, we will see beyond a person's happy mask that someone is really sad. And also, if someone we love is angry, we may see beyond the anger to hurt, to shame, to guilt, to anxiety, to nervousness. Mother Teresa comments on this. Mother Teresa, in her book, which I highly recommend, a book entitled Mother Teresa's Own Thoughts, she says this: try to understand why people behave as they do. Try to understand why people behave as they do. By the way, I didn't give you the correct title of Mother Teresa's book. The correct title is Mother Teresa in Her Own Words. It's a very short book, and again, I highly recommend it. Mother Teresa says when people around us do objectionable things, we should make a serious effort to understand why they're doing those objectionable things. It doesn't mean we have to excuse their behavior. But she claims we have an obligation to try to understand why people act the way they do. Schopenhauer and Russell, in this context, both believed that it's important that we realize that other people are fellow sufferers, that all people in this world suffer. And on this subject, the poet Longfellow, I think, provides some illumination. Longfellow said this, and I'm quoting him: "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each person's life suffering and sorrow enough to disarm all hostility." Eric Hoffer, the so-called longshoreman philosopher, emphasized compassion in so much of his work. Indeed, so many of the great thinkers have said that compassion is the indispensable element in love. Compassion, the indispensable element in love. Here is what Hafez said about compassion. Compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Compassion stands apart from the continuous traffic between good and evil proceeding within us. Where there is compassion, even the most poisonous impulses remain relatively harmless. Where there is compassion, even the most poisonous impulses in us remain relatively harmless. How can one spot the good lover around us? Well, I think we can all easily spot the good lovers around us. They are the very decent people in one's family, workplace, neighborhood. They include the conscientious, honorable carpenter, teacher, auto mechanic, doctor, business person, police, fire officer. Again, the very conscious, honorable people among them. Also, we can easily spot, I think, very decent parents, very loving parents. That one of the characteristics, I think, of very loving parents is that they teach their children to respect all people, regardless of religion or ethnicity. St. Paul, I think, provides a very good summing up of so much of what I've said in this program. And I wish to repeat the words I gave you concerning St. Paul early on in the program. He said this, and by the way, if you're looking for the attribution, it's in 1 Corinthians verses 1 through 5. Again, St. Paul said, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not insist on its own way. It bears all things, hopes all things, endures all things." In response to some of your inquiries, I wish to inform you, since some of you have asked, that I will be teaching on Staten Island. I will be teaching a course for the Staten Island Institute of Arts and Sciences beginning in early March. It will be an evening course. It will run 6 sessions, and my plan right now is to emphasize the theme of wisdom and what the great thinkers have said about wisdom. Again, the course will begin in March of the year 2005. If you're interested in perhaps taking the course, I suggest that you contact Maria Fiorelli at the Staten Island Institute of Arts and Sciences. And Miss Fiorelli's number is 718-727-1135, and you can reach her at extension 29. Again, Miss Fiorelli's number is 718-727-1135, extension 29. The present plan, as I understand it, at least based on my last conversation with her, is that while the course will be run by the Staten Island Institute of Arts and Sciences, it will be offered at the Snug Harbor Cultural Center. And again, I repeat, it's an evening course, running once a week for, I think, 6 sessions. Since we have a couple of minutes, what I'd like to do now is to recommend some books that you might find helpful in pursuing this theme of love. My guess is that some of you have already read some of these books. Maybe some of you have read all of these books. I think they all are very thought-provoking works, again, on the subject of love. I've already mentioned The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm. Fromm, as I said, was a psychoanalyst. He died some years ago. And in this book, called The Art of Love, he talks about what we can all do to learn how to love better. And as I said, in this book, he includes segments on romantic love, parental love, love of mankind, love of self, and love of God. In terms of the works of antiquity, perhaps the best known work is Plato's Symposium. It's a very short book, and again, a very thought-provoking book on love. Again, The Symposium by Plato. Also, I mentioned in passing Professor Leo Buscaglia's book entitled Love. By the way, all these books are in paperback. Every one of the books I'll be mentioning today, with the possible exception of the Bible, is in paperback. With regard to the Bible, I suggest that you read at least one small segment of it to provide some provocation concerning love. And again, the part of the Bible I suggest is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. Again, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which you'll find in Matthew 5. Among some great novels that address themselves to love, I highly recommend Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Lawrence writes about how complicated loving someone can be. And also, I highly recommend Swann's Way by Marcel Proust. Swann's Way is the first part of his very long book entitled Remembrance of Things Past. And in Swann's Way, Marcel Proust talks about the disquietude that romantic love can involve, the jealousy romantic love can involve. It's a terrific book, Swann's Way. And if you like it, you might continue on to read the rest of the book, the remaining 2,000 or so pages of the book. And another book which I think is a great book on love, a book about love and a loving relationship, romantic love, but which has no scenes concerning sex, as I recall, is Willa Cather's My Antonia. Again, My Antonia by Willa Cather. It's a great love story. And finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, he wrote, and I'm quoting him, "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."